Imagine waking in darkness. Your body is gone. Your name is all you have left. And somewhere ahead, in a hall older than memory, older than the pyramids, older than the gods themselves, a figure waits beside a pair of golden scales. He has the head of a jackal. Black as burnt earth. Tall ears. Eyes that have watched the border between life and death for longer than any human civilization has existed. On one side of the scale, a feather. On the other, your heart. If the scales balance, you pass into eternity. Your soul continues its journey through the duat, the underworld, toward the field of reeds, toward the life that waits beyond. But if they do not balance, something else is waiting. Part crocodile. Part lion. Part hippopotamus. Her name is Ammit, the devourer, and she sits in the shadows, watching the needle. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not a fairy tale. It was not a metaphor. It was the question at the center of death itself. Was your soul light enough to survive? And standing at the threshold, tending the scale, guiding the soul, holding the space between what was and what could be, was Anubis. Welcome to Ancient Mythos. In this episode, we enter the Hall of Two Truths to uncover Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian who watched over the dead, protected the body, guided the soul, and stood beside the scales where every heart revealed its weight. But before we follow him deeper into the underworld, we need to clear up the mistake modern stories keep making about Anubis. But here is the thing we almost always get wrong. When modern stories reach for Anubis, video games, movies, Halloween decorations, they paint him as a monster. A villain. The Egyptian god of death, lurking in shadows, waiting to drag souls into eternal punishment. The ancient Egyptians would have found that strange. Because Anubis was not the one you feared. He was the one you prayed to meet. Think about it. You have just crossed the horizon, that thin line where the gold sun meets the black unknown. Your body lies wrapped in linen in a stone chamber. Your heart is about to be weighed. If it tips the wrong way, Ammit is waiting. Who do you want standing next to you in that moment? Anubis. He was the guide. The protector. The one who held your body together, literally, so your soul had a home to return to. Every ritual, every linen wrap, every spell spoken over the flesh you were leaving behind, that was his work. His gift. This is the paradox of Anubis. The more you understand him, the less frightening he becomes, and the more terrifying the question he represents. Because Anubis does not need to threaten you. The scale does that for him. To understand Anubis, you have to understand Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a land of borders. The Nile Valley was green, fertile, alive. Every year the river flooded and left behind black silt, the dark soil that made civilization possible. But just beyond that narrow ribbon of life stretched the desert. Dry. Silent. Infinite. The Egyptians called it the Deshret, the Red Land. And it was filled with the dead. Because the earliest Egyptians buried their dead not in pyramids, not in grand tombs, but in simple graves dug into the desert sand at the edge of the Nile Valley. And the jackals came at night. They dug into those shallow graves. They tore at the bodies. It was not malice. It was survival. But for the living, watching from their reed huts at the edge of the necropolis, it must have looked like the dead were being devoured by the darkness itself. But then, somewhere in prehistory, one mind looked at that jackal standing on a dune, black against the setting sun, and saw something else. Not a scavenger. A guardian. The creature that haunted the cemetery became the god who protected it. The animal that fed on the dead became the figure who guarded them. That is the origin of Anubis. Not a god of death invented by priests in grand temples. A god born from observation, from watching what happened at the edge of the desert when the sun went down. And that black color, the black jackal head that makes Anubis so recognizable, it is more complicated than most people realize. In modern storytelling, black means death, darkness, evil. But in Egypt, black carried a second meaning. Kem, the ancient Egyptian word for black, was also the word for Egypt itself. Kemet, the black land. Named for the rich, fertile soil left behind by the Nile flood. The soil that made life possible in the middle of the desert. So when Anubis was painted black, he was not simply a symbol of death. He was a symbol of death guarded, preserved, and prepared for rebirth. The body turns black during embalming. The soil is black before the crops rise. The underworld is dark before the soul emerges into light. Anubis belongs to all of these thresholds. His blackness holds death and renewal together in a single image. Here is something many people do not know. Anubis is older than Osiris. In the earliest Egyptian traditions, the pyramid texts, carved into stone walls over 4,000 years ago, Anubis holds a central place among the dead. He is a lord of the afterlife. A guide for the departed. A god whose name meant something like, the one who is in the place of embalming. Later, as Egyptian religion evolved, Osiris became the great king of the underworld. He sat on the throne. He presided over judgment. He became the face of death itself. But Anubis never disappeared. Instead, his role became more precise. Osiris might rule the underworld. But Anubis controlled the doorway. He guarded the tomb. He watched over the mummification. He led the deceased through the dangerous passages of the Duat. He stood beside the scales. In one later tradition, and this is important because Egyptian mythology was never one single fixed story, Anubis is connected to the death of Osiris himself. After Seth murders Osiris and scatters his body, Anubis helps Isis restore and preserve him. Anubis performs the first mummification. Anubis becomes the divine model for every embalmer who will ever wrap a body in linen. So Osiris sits on the throne. But Anubis stands at the threshold. And the dead must pass through one to reach the other. To the Egyptians, death was not the end. But survival was not automatic. The body had to be preserved. The name had to be remembered. The proper rituals had to be performed. If any piece of this chain broke, the soul could be lost, trapped between worlds, forgotten, annihilated. This is where mummification becomes sacred technology. It was not just preservation in the modern sense, keeping flesh from rot. It was transformation. The body was prepared so that the soul, the Ba and the Ka, could recognize its home and return to it. The face was painted. The mouth was opened. The heart was left in place because the heart was the seat of memory, intention, and moral truth. Every night, the dead needed somewhere to return. The tomb became an eternal house. The mummy became an eternal body. And Anubis stood over every step of this process. Priests wore Anubis masks during burial rites. They became him, the divine embalmer, for the duration of the ritual. They spoke the words he had first spoken over the body of Osiris. They performed the gestures he had taught. Because if you were going to send a soul into eternity, you wanted the god of the threshold standing beside you. But preserving the body was only the first test. Because eventually, every soul had to face the scales. Picture a hall carved from stone and shadow. So old that the stars have moved since it was built. So sacred that the gods themselves sit in judgment. This is the hall of two truths. Here, at the end of the journey, the soul stands alone. At the center is a golden scale. On one side rests the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at is not a goddess in the simple sense. Ma'at is truth, balance, justice, cosmic order. The principle that keeps the stars in their paths and the Nile flooding on schedule. The feather represents everything that keeps the universe from falling into chaos. On the other side rests your heart. To the Egyptians, the heart was not a pump. It was the record of your life. Every choice, every lie, every kindness, every cruelty. The heart remembered everything you had done and everything you had failed to do. If the heart balanced with the feather, if your life had been lived in harmony with Ma'at, the soul could continue. Toward Osiris. Toward the field of reeds. Toward eternity. But if the heart was heavy, if it outweighed the feather. Nearby waits Ammit, the devourer. Part crocodile, the river's deadliest predator. Part lion, the desert's king. Part hippopotamus, the most dangerous animal in the Nile. She devours the heart. And without the heart, the soul cannot continue. This is not hell in the modern sense. There is no fire. No eternal torment. It is something colder, annihilation. The soul simply ceases to exist. In this scene, Anubis tends the scales. Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, records the result. Osiris presides from his throne. 42 assessor gods sit in judgment. And the dead stand in the center, waiting to learn whether their life was in balance. Before the weighing, the deceased must speak. This is called the negative confession, though declaration of innocence might be more accurate. And it is one of the most extraordinary texts the ancient world produced. Standing before the divine tribunal, the soul declares what it has not done. I have not committed evil against people. I have not mistreated cattle. I have not stolen from the offerings in the temples. I have not caused pain. I have not starved anyone. I have not caused suffering. I have not taken food from the mouth of a child. I have not killed. I have not told lies. I have not invaded another man's land. I have not polluted the water. I have not turned away from the face of goodness. The exact lists vary, different versions survive from different periods and different tombs. But the idea is the same across all of them. Your life is not measured by what you claim to believe. It is measured by how you actually lived. We live in a world of excuses. We are experts at justifying our failures. But in the hall of two truths, there is no justification. There is only the scale. And what makes this image so haunting, what has kept it alive for 4,000 years, is not the creature in the shadows. It is the idea that a life can be weighed. That every hidden thing becomes visible. That the truth of who you were can be placed on a scale and measured against the feather of cosmic order. If your entire existence had to be reduced to one weight on one scale, what would tip the beam? Thousands of years later, after the temples have crumbled, after the language has been forgotten, after the last priest of Anubis has turned to dust, the jackal-headed figure still haunts us. Why? Because Anubis is made of contradictions. He is animal and human. Beast and God. Death and protection. Darkness and gold. Fear and order. Modern pop culture often turns him into a villain. A monster. A death demon waiting in the dark. But that misses what made him powerful. He was frightening because death is frightening. But in the Egyptian imagination, he was also necessary. He was the one who guarded the body when the living walked away. The one who knew the rituals when the soul was lost. The one who stood beside the scales when every excuse was gone. The most unsettling thing about Anubis may not be that he judges the dead. It is that he does it with such silence. No fury. No mockery. No gloating. He stands beside the scale, watching the beam, as if the truth does not need anger to be terrifying. So if you found yourself in that hall, if your heart was on one side and the feather on the other, Anubis would not need to threaten you. He would not need to speak. The scale would do that. And maybe that is why this image has survived for so long. Not because Anubis was a monster in the dark. But because he represented something even more powerful, the belief that death was not chaos. Death had a doorway. Death had a ritual. Death had a guardian. And at the edge of eternity, beneath the black jackal's gaze, every heart finally reveals its weight. If you want the next journey into ancient myth, subscribe to Ancient Mythos, and tell me which god, which monster, or which forgotten underworld we should enter next. The hall is waiting.